In the interest of time, I'm supposed to have some opening remarks, but I'm going to bypass that because I think we're all here and wanting to hear from our keynote speaker, Ben Wellington. A lot of what we have talked about now at SCAG revolves around the future. Innovation is just not a word in our tagline, but it's now ingrained in our DNA. Our keynote speaker this morning exemplifies the future. Dr. Ben Wellington is the creator of IQNY, a data science policy blog that focuses on insights drawn from New York City's public data and advocates for the expansion and improvements of that data. I recently just came back from New York City, and I can tell you that there has been some amazing work that has occurred in New York City, and so I just want to congratulate them with all their green streets and all their bikes and all the data that they're using to move forward in New York. He is also a contributor to The New Yorker and is visiting assistant professor in the City and Regional Planning Program at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, where he teaches statistics using urban open data. He also works as a quantitative analyst in the investment management firm Two Sigma, where he helped start the firm's Data Clinic, a pro bono data analysis program that works with nonprofits to harness the power of their own data. He holds a PhD in computer science from New York University. Please help me and give a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Dr. Ben Wellington. Dr. Ben Wellington, you look like you're 15 years old. You look very young. You look definitely like the future.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Wow, hi, it's such an honor and pleasure to be speaking to SCAG today about something that I am truly passionate about, and that is, if you haven't guessed by now, open data, depending if you call it data or data. Everyone has a different opinion on that. Open data is this idea that instead of having to reach out to government and ask for individual data sets, that it just kind of gets all posted, and people can go and browse and find what they need, and that makes things way more efficient. So I'm going to be telling you stories today, stories from New York City, where I live, because what I've been doing in New York is just analyzing the data in New York City to understand what's happening there and make some recommendations. So this started, by the way, because I married an urban planner. My wife, Leslie, worked in city government, both on the, urban planners, woo! The best. I love them, literally, right? I love them. So I was a computer scientist, data analysis. She's an urban planner. Today runs a nonprofit called the Urban Manufacturing Alliance for studying manufacturing across the country. And this got me really into government because what happened is open data started to grow. And I can tell you the story from New York City's view, which is that Mayor Bloomberg signed into law the open data laws in around 2012 in New York. And there was an interesting quote there. And he said, across city government, agencies use data, develop policy, implement programs, and track performance. And each month, our administration shares more and more of the data with the public at large, catalyzing the creativity, intellect, and enterprising spirit of computer programmers to build tools that help us all improve our lives. This is the 2012 view of open data, right? And what did the city do? They started doing these app competitions. Who can build apps, more and more apps? But they were missing something, right? Because what the then Mayor Bloomberg said was that open data is about computer programmers. And this is not true. Open data is definitely not about computer programmers. It's a lot bigger, right? It's about getting data to the people, to anybody, to nonprofits, to government officials. In fact, one of the biggest users of the New York City Open Data Portal are New York City employees. Because trying to get data from one agency to the other, is, as you probably all know, is not an easy thing to do. So by having it centralized, suddenly even the city itself is more efficient. So I believe it can go through policymakers. It should go to nonprofits. It should go to planners, news agencies, right? Bloggers, why not? Anyone really who has interest in this should have access to the open data. And that's where things are moving. So New York City has an open data portal, as do cities around the entire country. Countries have open data portals, cities, and as we know, associations have it. In fact, SCAG has its own portal. This is an old version, but there's a newer and updated one which has some really great features, so you can check that out. So really this is a growing thing, and there's some amazing data sets there. And I'm going to try to tell you stories about what you can do with all this data, because people put it out there and then they say, then what? Now what? I put all this data up. What happens next? Well, that's what these stories are about. You see, I started writing a blog about this just to get the word out that there was this public data. And it was called iQuantNY, as in I quantify New York. That was my goal, to really quantify the city by analyzing data. And I started to make maps like this one. Really not that interesting. This is cyclist injuries and collisions caused by bicycles. So really, where are cyclists getting injured around New York? In the middle, you see Manhattan, and there's red areas. The red areas are more dangerous, and allowed me to see things like Williamsburg, which is known to have a lot of cyclists, has more injuries. Okay, fine. There was an area that had been known in Roosevelt, called Roosevelt Avenue, where there was a lot of injuries, and this just popped in the data. Now, this is literally me learning how to use GIS software, like file, save as, heat map. It wasn't deep analysis. It was literally, file, save as, or export. And all of a sudden, it started to show up on websites, right? Someone said I called Williamsburg a death trap, which I never did. Someone wrote Killingsburg in a headline, and I was like, oh, this is getting out of control. Then The Atlantic started to write about it. I was suddenly on The Atlantic. All I did was go to File, Save As, and I'm in The Atlantic. And something struck me, that if you tell stories with data, they're compelling. People listen, and they perk up. And all you have to do is put some information behind your narratives. That's so much of data and science today. We don't teach storytelling in our science classes, but we should, right? We should be teaching storytelling. It's one of the most important parts of science, because if you can't tell what's happening, what's the point? So that's what I started to do, tell the stories within. Now let's go to a world before open data. This is a chart of the number of cars in New York City that are doing transportation. So you have all the way on the left is for-hire vehicles, where there were 25,000, 18,000 of these green taxis, which could only operate in parts of the city, 13,000 taxis. These are the kind of numbers we used to get out of government, right? Every chart you ever see is a narrative. It's somebody's choice of what they want to say. But with open data, you open up the narrative. Anyone can make their own narrative. So instead of counting taxis, these are sophisticated machines driving around in our streets with GPS recorders. They know every time they pick someone up, drop someone off, how much they paid. And all we get out is a count. Something's not working there. But if you get access to the data, I said to myself, I can figure out the speed of all of these cabs at all times of day. So I'm going to use the cab fleet to measure traffic in New York City. And I was just wondering, when is rush hour in New York City? So I mapped the average speed of cabs. And what I found is that they're fastest at 5:18 in the morning, and then go downhill. They're going 11.5 miles an hour by 8:30 on average in New York. And it turns out they stay that way all day. So there's no rush hour in New York, just rush day. It's interesting, but it's the kind of thing you can do when you open up your data, right? You start to empower people to do this kind of analysis. Now, there's a caveat here, which I did this a few years ago, and I had to file a Freedom of Information request. Right? No one likes those. It turns out that I had to because the data wasn't put out there for me, right? And in fact, the Taxi and Limousine Commission went ahead. They actually had a form. They're so used to these requests that they had a form you fill out. What data set do you want? Where do you want it? Then they made you bring a hard drive, brand new, unopened, down to the thing, drop it off. They would give you the data on the hard drive and give it back to you. In today's world, that is kind of absurd, right? This was a few years ago. Well, this changed recently, and now the data is on the Open Data Portal. And what's happened? An explosion of analysis going on in the taxi world that the Taxi and Limousine Commission is learning from, because they've gotten rid of that barrier. There's no more freedom of information requests, which is, by the way, inefficient for them and for users. It doesn't make a lot of sense. I would argue that's semi-open data, right? There's data, but it's kind of hidden. You have to go through hoops. And it uses really valuable agency time to just give the data out. So why not make that data public when it's not a violation of security, of privacy? Obviously, there are exceptions. But the default of open data is, unless you have a good reason, to release it. There are many good reasons not to release data, trust me. There's privacy concerns, there's security concerns, there's, hopefully political concerns isn't one of them. But honestly, if you have a concern, then maybe it shouldn't go out. But otherwise, the default is out, as opposed to the default is closed. It's a big jump in the way you think, but it empowers so much. This data set, by the way, that I analyzed before for the bicycle injuries came from one of these guys. Y'all know that file, right? PDF file. PDF files are kind of where data goes to die, okay? They're a way for an agency to put out data but not really make it accessible, right? The law says I have to, I'll release this, here, have fun. Well, what's happening today is we have these volunteers across the country who are writing PDF scrapers to get the data that government had in computer format, then made non-accessible, and make it format again. We have thousands of people across the country taking their time, volunteering because they care so much about their cities, that they want that data that's been released, but the government has put it into PDFs to keep them from getting it. It'll get out, by the way. It gets out. You're just using citizens' time. You're just using up time. And what happens? Well, in this case, this guy, John Krause, wrote this thing. This used to be the way that New York City released traffic accidents. It was a 1,000-page PDF file where every row was one accident. This is one accident per row, a 1,000-page PDF file. So someone wrote a PDF scraper, would go to the website, download it, and then make a computer readable on his own website automatically. The second it was published, he'd copy a version. And eventually they realized, well, this is silly. And today, the New York Police Department releases this in CSV format, a way that people can read. So we're seeing, in both these cases, the Taxi and Limousine Commission, the New York Police Department, in the last 2 or 3 years, we're seeing dramatic change in the way that data is getting released. We're not putting up artificial barriers to keep people from getting data. We're actually, hey, here it is. I would call that kind of also releases kind of semi-open data, right? It's using valuable talent, and we don't want to do that. So now I'm going to tell you a bunch of examples of things you can do with all this data, and some are kind of silly, some are very meaningful and impactful, and we'll go through them all. So for example, this is where people in New York City, what % of tickets in every neighborhood are given to somebody who doesn't live in New York State. So it's kind of a way to look at visitors, right? Kind of. It's a proxy, it's not going to be perfect. But I was curious, what % of parking tickets are given to people who are not from New York in every neighborhood? And what you can see here is the island on the northwest. You can see kind of Central Park as a little rectangle, but really the main takeaway is that visitors seem to go to Manhattan. Okay. But you can actually break that down for the state of every license plate. So I can actually see where people from New Jersey drive into New York City by studying parking tickets. All right? And I see that they do not go into Brooklyn. They kind of stop. They're coming from the west, and they sort of stop in Manhattan. I can take where people from Connecticut go, and it's different. They come from the north. They're going to places up north, different neighborhoods. And I can study this using parking tickets. Right? But this is my personal favorite. And this is where people from California get tickets in New York City, because they only get tickets in the coolest parts of Brooklyn. This is like Williamsburg. These are the hippest neighborhoods in New York City. And when you look at California parking ticket imprints, they light up like crazy. So Californians going to New York are only going to be seen in the coolest parts of New York City. You can see that in the map. I understand. Yeah. Now that I'm here, I see why. On a more serious note, here's an analysis of just crime in New York City. Up until this, literally 6 months ago, the only data we got on crime was for every precinct and every month, how many of each crime happened. That's an aggregate number. We don't know when the crime happened. We don't know where it happened. We know that the precinct and the count for the month. Well, in the last year, now we have access to this information. We can start to actually understand crime. This is a big deal. And it's not to say that the New York City Police Department can't understand crime. It's to say that if you make it public, you can draw insights from universities, from students, from everybody. And suddenly you're kind of outsourcing idea generation. And this is a dramatic thing. And here I just studied robberies in New York City. What time of day do they happen? And I figured probably most often late in the evening. Well, it turned out I was wrong. More robberies happen between 3 and 4 p.m. in New York City than any other time. I scratched my head. You know, and in the old days, I don't know. But now I have open data. I can actually look at every crime. So I decided to break them down into days, into school days and non-school days. So what we see here is the blue line are weekdays when kids are in school, and that is the time that New York City schools are let out. And the red line is are weekdays where students are on vacation. And what you can see is there's no spike during the school let-out time. And this is not a happy finding, but it's an important policy finding. And it's a finding that the public is not aware about. But for the first time, we're starting to understand the patterns. You know, can we advocate for a better after-school programming? Can we locate where these crimes are happening and really target the enforcement, or not necessarily enforcement, but a programming to help with this to different areas, right? With open data, you can actually zero in. Whereas before, I just had a number, 27. This is so much more powerful than the number 27, right? I can go and I can see for myself. And, you know, it really makes a big difference, as you can see. Other interesting things, this is just kind of for fun. I just went into the Los Angeles pound. They have data on the animals that they're getting. And I just found I was comparing different cities, and I found that Chihuahua was the #1 animal there, and mini poodles was number 3, whereas in Austin, Texas, mini poodles was very low. So you can actually start to study our dog preferences, which I know is not important, but it's still fascinating, right? We can study ourselves. Other interesting things that you can do that are a lot of fun. All right, this tells a little story. I wanted to know when people decorate for Christmas. I was just curious. When do people decorate for Christmas? There's no data set on that. But there is, because the country maintains a log of emergency room visits, and they write down what causes all those emergency room visits. So you get to find out for a percent, you know, would they fall off a ladder? You know, when you hear about a product that needs a recall because this type of chair is unsafe, that's coming from this database. Well, if you look at the injuries caused by Christmas ornaments over time, and you graph when these injuries are happening, you can see the orange dots, the orange lines there is Thanksgiving. So you can really see the Christmas ornaments are sending people to the hospital starting in Thanksgiving, and it really kind of peaks about a week after, maybe the beginning of December, and starts to go down. And then you can see Christmas is that red line, and then it kind of pops back up. That's people taking down their decorations. What did I learn? Taking down decorations is safer than putting up decorations. It's important. Why do I show you this example? Not because this is such an important thing to know, but sometimes the data you're looking for could be in a completely different space. This is why open data is so important. When you put data out, you do not know what someone's going to do with it. You're just creating innovation. You think you might know what someone's going to do with it, but you don't. Because people are going to think outside the box and use your data in unexpected ways. I guarantee you nobody thought that parking tickets would help study where people move around New York. That wasn't why that data was released. A lot of this data is released under the umbrella of accountability and transparency. And these are important things. I'm not putting them down. But there's more to it. It's not just transparency, right? Transparency is a one-way thing. It's, oh, we deserve to know what government's doing. This is not just transparency. This is partnership. This is, if you give the people data, then they will help you. They will help you explore things. And by the way, not everything they find you're going to like. And that's part of the trade-off you're going to have to make. But it's empowering, because you're suddenly giving it out to people all across the world to help you understand something. And you don't even know what you'll understand. You don't even know what questions you're asking yet sometimes. Another data set, I found the amount of, this is kind of gross, but we're not eating, so the amount of fecal coliform in waterways around New York City. They measure this bacteria that goes along with sewage. And there's a data set where every week they sample all the different water areas. The bigger the circle here, the more dirty it is. And I was just curious, what area in New York had the most dirty water as measured by fecal matter in the water? Why do we have that? Well, we have combined sewer outflows. I'm sure many of you are familiar with those. What happens is that when it rains very hard, it goes through the same system that the sewage does, and it can't keep up at some point, and they unfortunately dump into our waterways. This doesn't happen daily, obviously, but it does happen enough that this creates a problem. And this allows you to study it using open data. So what did I find? I found that there was one area, not Coney Island where you swim, but something called Coney Island Creek, where 94% of samples taken had levels above state law to be in the water. So it would be illegal to swim there 94% of the time. This is interesting. I learned a few things. One is never swim in anything that ends in creek or canal. It's good to know. Write that down. I also, it was an interesting thing because when I made this map, I didn't know what to map. I needed to map, if I mapped milliliters per gram or gram per milliliter, excuse me, no one would care. If I came to you and said, hey, this place had 40 grams per milliliter, you'd say, I'm not a scientist. That doesn't mean anything. What means to you? Hey, wow, it would be illegal to swim there 90% of the time. So what I've done is I've taken a raw data set and I've converted something that everyone can understand and relate to. That's important. If you're going to do data analysis, you need to relate to the people you're talking to. And that's what I'm trying to do with this blog. By the way, a year later, this article came out in the same place. Apartments dump 200,000 gallons of sewage per day into Coney Island Creek. So, this data, although I don't know why I was the one finding the outliers and analyzing it, but sometimes people are busy. Agencies have a lot of data to go through. And the fact that I was able to kind of point to this as an outlier and then an investigation may have happened based on that, maybe it was unrelated, I don't know. But I do know that about a year later, they found that there were some large buildings dumping all of their things directly into the waterway in the exact spot that had those levels. And are they related? I guess. I don't know. I'm not in government. I can't speak about it. But this is the kind of thing you can look for. And by the way, these are outliers. And I want to point out that most of the work you're seeing here is counting. This is not sophisticated analysis. This is not some crazy model. This is counting. I literally just did an average, or a count, or a sum. All these things, these are high school math, everything I'm showing you, every single thing. All right, so I'm gonna give you now examples for the last part of this talk on ways that I've actually gotten New York City to change just by writing about stuff and public data. Now, today, this happens in a way that I do not love. I write about this, I post it on my blog, it gets picked up by the media, and then the city responds to the media with a quote, and then they make a change. Now, this is totally crazy, but this is the way it is today because citizens do not have ways to interact with city agencies. Maybe that's not true in every city, but I don't know. If I find a problem in a data set, I find something, I maybe have someone to call now because I've built relationships with the city over time, but I'm doing this as a regular person. And until I have a channel to communicate with government on open data findings, this is the best thing I can do is write about it. And this isn't healthy, but this is where we are. And I think that we can do better by opening up lines of communication and really working with the community to answer these questions. So here's my first example for you. This is the vending machine when you buy a Metro card in the New York City subway. What happens is you push one of these buttons and you get a bonus. And you end up with these different amounts. You're asked how much you want to put on this card, and they give you a bonus. Now, every ride at this time was $2.50. And if you hit the button all the way on the right, you would end up with exactly $19.95. So you would ride 7 times, and you'd have $2.45 left, and you couldn't ride the subway. You'd be missing a nickel. And that's the button they're offering every user. In fact, I showed that if you use their buttons, you could literally never empty your card. You literally could never get $0 on your card by using their buttons. Literally. Mathematical proof I did. There's no way to empty it. And I don't think this is malicious. I think this is just the round numbers, and they had $10 bills and $20 bills, but it is the way it works. Now, they released a statement, these machines do not hold an infinite amount of change, and the denominations are suggested to ensure there is ample change to accommodate customers to pay with cash. That being said, we will look at this as part of the process involved in rolling out the next scheduled fare increase slated for next year. All right. So I think they're tying me to the fare increase. Well, fare increase comes, and what happens? They added a new button. There's now a new button on every single vending machine in New York City. Yeah. 27, 25, you hit that, and you got exactly 11 rides, not a penny over. Right? Now, it's not because I'm OCD. It's just because it's more efficient. You have tourists coming. Why are we just taking money out of their pockets? Imagine if you had to go to a store, and instead of saying, I want to buy 3 apples, you can't go in the New York City subway and say, I want to buy 3 rides. Nope. I want to put this amount of money, we're going to do math, give you this much. It's still a problem. Other things to show you. I know in LA, they have a similar scheme as New York City, which is health inspection grades on restaurants. So what we have are A's and B's and C's, and they're in the window. So everyone knows that you're a C restaurant, and in theory, people are not too happy about this. So what I did is I counted the number of restaurants who got A's, B's, and C's, and I made this chart. The green are A's. These violations are if you get 13 or more points, you get a B. Or 13 or less, you get an A. 14 and higher to B, and then 27 and higher C. So what do you notice all the way at number 13, which is the right side of the green? A lot of crowding. How are all these restaurants getting exactly on the border of the lowest A possible? And no one, 1/5 as many, are getting the highest B possible. What's going on there? Because they're 1- and 2-point violations. Are they all just like, let's do just enough? Probably not, right? What's probably happening is inspectors, they care, they're humans too, and they're being lenient, right? And maybe you're right on the border. Okay, I'm going to help you out. I'm going to look the other way. I'm assuming that's what's happened. I can't say for sure. If I had data, if I had the data of the inspector ID, I could make one of these charts for every inspector and tell you who's doing it. The agency has that. I don't. Interesting thing to do. But they made a response saying, inspectors are not instructed to offer leniency, just to cite what they see. The final score is based on the extent of the violation the inspector observes. Now, what's the problem with having that human emotion helping out there? Unfortunately, we all have biases. And I'm working on, I haven't published this yet, but on a book that I'm working on with Riverhead, I do a chapter exploring that these biases end up, the amount that people are getting bumped up is different depending on the ethnicity of the restaurant. And I know this sounds bad, but in reality, I don't think it's malice. I don't think people are, we all have unconscious biases. And as soon as you allow human to tinker with things, even if they mean well, bad things can happen. So this is a kind of thing we can study with open data that we would never see otherwise. By the way, here's the histogram from LA. It's much, much worse. Everyone gets an A. There's no, it's very, very different. Much, much worse. You can see the giant pile right at the top of the A, yeah. So I don't know what that's about. I don't know the local settings, but it's interesting. A few more examples before I wrap up. This is taxi tipping in New York. You get in the cab, and you're offered to, at the end of your ride, you're given an option to tip. And they said, you want to tip 20, 25, or 30%. Those are your options, 20, 25, 30. I think they didn't throw 15 in there as part of the negotiation with the cab industry to allow this to come in. What I found is that there were 2 manufacturers of these machines in the back of the New York City cabs. One was Creative Mobile Technologies. The other was Verifone. It turned out that the programmers at each company had programmed the tipping algorithm differently. That one of them was tipping on top of tolls and taxes, and the other one wasn't. So the drivers of cabs driven by Creative Mobile Technologies were making $300 to $400 more a year because of this rounding happening during the tipping button, because everyone hits those 20% buttons, or the 25 and 30. So they're making $300 to $400 more a year, unbeknownst to anyone, until this data was public, and I was analyzing, I put it out. The Tax and Limiting Commission gave me maybe my favorite quote of all time. We appreciate the work that went into its analysis, and we're giving it a thorough read. 2 weeks later, they reprogrammed all the cabs in New York City. Now everybody tips on tops of tolls and taxes. But at least it's uniform. At least it's uniform, right? Other things. The 5th precinct, here's a tweet. New York City has a Twitter handle of every precinct on the back of every police car. They're using Twitter to engage with citizens. The 5th precinct had a 115% increase in bicycle collisions. Police officers will be enforcing violations with bicyclists. # bike, space safety. So this is the police department saying, hey, this is really bad, 115% increase. But with open data, I could go and check this. More than double the number of collisions sounds really suspicious. Really suspicious. I went and analyzed it, and it was actually a drop. So I wrote about that, and the police department, well, they didn't say anything in the police department, but I would hope there would be something. 2 more examples. This is the New York City budget for this current year. What happened is, for the first time in history, New York made its budget machine readable. What does that mean? It used to be in a PDF, and even today the legislators get a giant binder, and they have to vote on the budget. Huge binder of papers, and everyone has the things they want, and you know more about it than I do probably, many of you. But, so this is the first time you can analyze it, and I'm just wondering what the largest expense of the police department was. So I sorted in the budget that was released, and it was called, at the very top, you can see something called Protection of Foreign Missions. $800 million. Protection of foreign missions, $800 million. This is the largest single expense. It was like 4% of all New York City money. It was a lot of money. And as I dug in, I realized it was a typo. That it was supposed to say something else. But it had made it through the entire budget process. No one had noticed this $800 million. The largest expense of the police department had been written to the wrong place. And it went through the whole, it got voted, it got adopted. We were going along, and then I pointed it out. They went and, amended it and fixed it. But what does this tell us? It tells us we're not using the right tools to do our jobs, right? I think it was no single legislator's job to find that one thing, and everyone has the things they're working on. And it was probably on page 428, section C, and I can't really blame if you're not given the tools, if you can't explore data, how are you going to find this? But it's kind of interesting, to say the least, that this made it through the entire budget process. They made a fix, Okay. And this is, I'll end on this one. These are fire hydrants in New York City, but not just any fire hydrant. These are the top grossing revenue fire hydrants. If you park within 15 feet of any of these hydrants, you get a parking ticket, okay? So what did I find? I found basically that there's one area of the city where they're very aggressive about this. That's fine. But then I found these 2 hydrants that together were making over $55,000 a year just being hydrants. They were making more than minimum wage being fire hydrants. It's incredible, right? So I went and looked, and there was this fire hydrant, and then there was what looked like a bike lane and then a parking spot. So the Department of Transportation had painted a bike spot, but then there was a bike lane. But it turned out it wasn't a bike lane. It was called a curb extension, which how would the person driving know, and blah, blah, blah. Whatever it was, they painted a parking spot, and the police department did not like it, and they did this for years. So even Google Street View, this is a shot from Google Street Maps, where you can see tickets on the windshield. If you go back through the years, you can see ticket, 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 ticket. This is a big problem. So the Department of Transportation responded, while the DOT has not received any complaints about this area, we will review the roadway markings and make any appropriate alterations. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, they repainted the spots to prevent this from happening. Now, one could argue, oh, you've lost this revenue for the city. Maybe, but I deep down don't think that that's the type of revenue that the city is trying to get. I believe that this wasn't somebody being tricky and trying to trick people. These are, you can call it dirty laundry, but these are simple things in complex systems. Governments are incredibly complex. There are so many corners. We can't expect everyone to look at everything. But open data kind of allows that. Now, there's a cultural shift because it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable that people see what you're doing, and it's scary, right? It's scary to open up, but it's also incredibly powerful. So if you can get over that hump, if you can just see the future, it's the democratization of data. It allows citizens, allows people to participate in government in new and exciting ways. And I will end by showing you, teaching the urban planners at Pratt, they take data sets that have thousands of rows, and they're now able to do things like analyze the types of cars getting into collisions right outside the school. These are people with no programming experience. They're just using Excel, drag and drop. And they're starting to analyze things. And even high school students are getting in on the act. Here's graffiti complaints from New York, and they're, hey, colored pencils. Why not? Drawing maps of where graffiti is. And I know that there's also, I forget what they're called, but you're doing the story competition. You're going to see more of next year. This is exactly the kind of thing we want to see, right? We see that SCAG has put some data out, and there's a you'll hear more about how exciting that is. Because that is the future. That is what open data can be. It can be a tool for people to participate in government in new ways. And like I said, it can be uncomfortable. And by the way, you might think I have a bad relationship with New York City. I don't. In fact, the head of the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics, number one, has gone to hire more people because of my work. Why don't we know that? Oh, let's get more people. But two, uses these as examples of the success of open data. New York City has used these examples in legislative hearings, in different areas, as success, not as failure. And that's a cultural shift. And I hope you all see that. I hope you all join me in the excitement of what open data can bring for the future. Thank you. Sure.
Awesome.
Oh, thank you.
We're going to present this to you
Ooh.
and have them come up so we can take a picture. Hassan, stay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Oh, thanks for having me. Yeah. Thank you.